Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 10, which is personality. So, in terms of an introduction to personality, temperament is this distinct pattern of emotional reactions and behaviors observed early in life. We talk about temperament when we talk about developmental psychology and infants, and really it's the how of behavior. How do people approach any situation? And so when we talk about easy versus difficult temperaments, that's kind of the most simplistic comparison between babies' temperaments. And it's really how do these infants or toddlers kind of approach life? And you could imagine having a toddler and telling the child, I need you to clean up your room. And someone with an easy temperament would say, all right, even if they didn't really want to do it, and go ahead and get started and get it done. And a difficult temperament, that child might throw a temper tantrum and scream and say no. It's how they approach, and it's not just that situation, it would be every situation. Do you approach it with an easygoing temperament or with a difficult temperament? Personality is the unique core characteristics that influences the way one thinks, acts, and feels, and are relatively consistent and enduring throughout the lifespan. It's the what. It's the what do you do that expresses your personality. And we're going to go through and talk about different ways we think about a person's personality as well as measure a person's personality in psychology. And you could think about yourself and you kind of know what your personality is. What are you kind of more likely to do? Are you introverted, extroverted? The idea of your own personality. And there are many theories about personality that we'll talk about, kind of going with the different perspectives that we talked about in the very beginning of class in terms of psychoanalytic, behavioral, humanistic, social cognitive, biological, and we will talk about trait theory for personality. So we'll start really with the historical theory that started it all, which was Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality. And he came up with a system of psychotherapy and tools for exploring personality through the unconscious. This was developed in the early 1900s and really is the beginnings of psychology and personality psychology. And that's really why we study it. We've kind of moved on from there. We're going to talk about this, a lot of psychoanalytic theory, which isn't based very much in science. And so now we have really moved on into other ways to assess personality, but this is the beginnings. This is Freud who really began it all. So personality in Freud's theory is motivated by inner forces and conflicts about which people have little awareness and they have little control. So psychoanalytic theory is really focused on unconscious forces that act as determinants of your personality. As I said, Freud's approach is historical for sure, and so that gives us a reason to study it. It's controversial and it lacks quite a bit of scientific support. But he presented these novel and groundbreaking insights on personality. And this was just the beginnings. His theory is based mostly on case studies. So let's talk about some of the key features and the key ideas behind Freud's psychoanalytic theory. So number one, he proposed 3 levels of consciousness. And you could think about it as this iceberg analogy. This picture is in your book. That you've got consciousness, right? Everything you're aware of. And that's this very top of the iceberg. And you've got pre-consciousness. These are mental activities outside your awareness, but you can easily bring them into your awareness. You're not thinking of them at the moment, but they're right there ready for you to kind of bring those thoughts into your consciousness if you need to. And then your unconscious, which are activities outside your awareness, they're difficult to bring into consciousness without significant effort and or therapy. It's kind of all of this underneath the this iceberg underneath the water, and you can see it's a huge amount. And really, Freud believed that it's our unconscious that really drives our conscious our behaviors. So the unconscious is part of your personality. It contains memories, knowledge, beliefs, feelings, urges, drives, instincts, all of which you're not aware of. It's psychological material that your mind is not attending to. Freud believed that your unconscious was a safe haven for memories of threatening events. So you would put things that were upsetting, difficult, urges that maybe you shouldn't have, aggressive urges, sexual urges. You kind of push those all into your subconscious because it's a safe place to put them. And you can get a glimpse of people's unconscious in different ways. Freud, we're going to talk about dream analysis and dream interpretation, believed that we could get to our unconscious with a therapist helping interpret our dreams. Also by Freudian slips, you might have heard that term before, a slip of the tongue where you accidentally say something and that you didn't mean to say. And it gives you a glimpse into what the person's unconscious is really thinking. So maybe, and you could look those up. There's some really funny Freudian slips on the internet that people say something and all of a sudden they're talking, giving maybe a very professional presentation, and they say, oh, and I worked great with this person and we had great sex. Oh, I mean, we worked really well together, right? That was like a slip of the tongue. They didn't actually have sex, but it was something in their unconscious that kind of slipped out, right? This unconscious drive or sexual drive or urge. So that's part of Freud. Freud also believed that we had three components of our personality. They called it the structural model of the mind. And that's this, in this unconscious part, we've got kind of three separate areas or structures. We have the id, and you can see again, this is the largest part in Freud's theory. This is the primitive, raw, inborn part of your personality. This id has your primary biological drives like hunger, sex, aggression, some irrational impulses. You could think about how babies react to things when you think about the id. What drives a baby? When they're hungry, they want to eat. They don't care what time it is, if it's convenient or not convenient, they just want to eat, and they're going to cry until they get to eat. And if they're tired, they just want to sleep, and they're just going to cry until they get to sleep. And if they're unhappy, they might, again, scream or cry or throw a temper tantrum. This is just our primary drives and urges. We say that the id operates on what we call the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is just whatever makes me happy at the moment, that's what I want to do. It maximizes your satisfaction. And again, these occurs at an unconscious level. You're not thinking about this when we talk about the id part of your personality, but it's all these unconscious drives that you were born with, these aggressive, sexual type of drives that really are very impulsive and oftentimes illogical. Then we also have the superego. The superego develops later, and this is really the part of your personality that's guided by the rights and wrongs of society, how you've learned and interpret what is appropriate to do, what is not appropriate to do. And you learn this by your parents, your teachers, your caregivers, others around you, society at large. We often refer to the superego as our conscience, right? It makes you feel guilty if you do something that's morally wrong. And most of this activity, again, is in the preconscious and unconscious levels, your superego. This is the internalized rules of society. And then we have your ego up here. Your ego is the part of your personality that buffers between the id and the superego. So between all of your kind of inborn illogical drives and all the rules that you've learned about how to kind of appropriately act in society. And so this is the ego, or the buffer between the id and the superego. It helps you to manipulate situations, plan for the future, solve problems, make decisions. And we say that this is guided by the reality principle. The ego is really based on the reality principle. How do we take our instinctual energy, our id, and restrain it in a way to keep the individual safe, help the person integrate in society based on the superego? And so it's kind of balancing these two forces to get your needs met while fitting in to what's appropriate and morally and ethically appropriate. So you could think about these. I've got 3 questions for you, and you could think about the answer. If you need a second, just pause this, and then I'll give you the answer right after. So is this the id, the ego, or the superego at work? Barbara has been dieting for 1 week in an effort to lose 5 pounds before her senior prom. Today, however, a friend offered her a piece of her favorite chocolate cake. That looks so good. Although Barbara knew she should not accept it, the temptation was irresistible, and she happily accepted it, relishing every bite. So what part of her personality is working there? The id, the ego, or the superego? And hopefully you would say the id, right? This is just her drive of wanting that cake. Oh, look, it's a moving one. Good picture there. Robert was at home studying for his physics exam when his friend telephones to say he has 2 extra tickets for the basketball playoffs. 1 ticket was for that evening and the other was for the next evening. The friend invited Robert to join him on both evenings. Although Robert is an avid basketball fan and wanted to go to both games, he told his friend that he was studying for an exam and he would not be able to join him tonight. He said he would certainly accept the invitation to tomorrow night's game. So what part of the personality is that based on Freud's psychoanalytic theory? Hopefully you think that's the ego, right? That's kind of balancing your wanting and your drive to go to the game, but knowing you need to study, and so the ego kind of provides that balance. And here we go with Joanne, a 15-year-old high school sophomore who had just moved to a new neighborhood and was invited to a party by a group of people whom she had recently met. Michael, one of the boys in the group, said, "Hey, Joanne, I just got my driver's license, and my father is lending me his car. Let me pick you up at 8. Although Joanne wanted to accept the offer, she knew her parents would disapprove of her riding in a car with a newly licensed driver whom she didn't know. Regretfully, she said, "No thanks, I already have a ride." And which part of the personality is this? Hopefully you're thinking superego, right? This is the morals and the kind of rights and wrongs, and kind of thinking and taking in the rules her parents had given her. All right, Freud also talks about defense mechanisms. Probably heard that term, defense mechanisms. Well, that comes from Freud and his psychoanalytic theory. And these are unconscious processes that the ego uses to distort perceptions and memories and reduce anxiety created by the id superego conflict. Because remember, those are often in conflict, the id and the superego. And so in order to reduce some of that anxiety, we unconsciously use our brain kind of creates these defense mechanisms that we're often unaware of, and they're not necessarily bad. Some may be more adaptive than others. And so you can look through these. I know this is also in your book in terms of some you've probably heard of: denial, right? Refusing to recognize a distressing reality. And so instead of saying like, "Oh, I'm physically attracted to my best friend's boyfriend," that's her id. And the superego, "How dare I'm wrong to feel these impulses." And so we have this anxiety situation. So if we're doing something like denial, and again, you're not thinking you're doing it, this is unconscious, you end up saying, "I don't like him, he's not my type," and kind of denying the fact that you're having this physical attraction. or a projection, right? Attributing your own kind of anxiety-provoking thoughts to someone else. Instead of you accepting that you are physically attracted to the best friend's boyfriend, you say, like, what's wrong with Sarah, some other friend? She's always checking out other people's boyfriends. You're projecting your kind of illogical or unconscious drives onto someone else. And you can go through rationalization, repression, pushing them kind of below the surface so you're not even really thinking about it, avoiding your best friend and her boyfriend in social situations, etc. And there's an activity in Launchpad for you to kind of use these. I think they make more sense when you work through these a little on your own. But defense mechanisms, that's Freud. Freud also talked about psychosexual stages. This is one of, again, his more famous parts of his personality theory, and probably the most controversial, that according to Freud, the development of sexuality and personality kind of proceed together through what he calls psychosexual stages. And Freud's theory is very focused on the sexual drives and development. And all children experience these psychosexual stages as they mature into adulthood. Each stage is associated with an erogenous zone and a conflict to resolve. And if those conflicts are not resolved in a good way, if they're poorly resolved, they can result in what Freud labeled a fixation, an unresolved conflict that persists beyond the stage in which they first occur. And that can come from having your needs ignored or being overindulged during that stage. So let's get into Freud's psychosexual stages. We start at the oral stage. So this is from birth to 1 to 1.5 years, and the erogenous zone or the focus is on the mouth. The infant's center of pleasure is the mouth, and babies put everything in their mouth. So that kind of makes sense, right? They're either eating, or they're chewing on a rattle, or they're chewing on a toy, or they're chewing on their hand. Everything goes in their mouth. The conflict centers on weaning, right? And moving into eating foods from breastfeeding or bottle feeding. And if there is a problem with weaning, either a parent doesn't let the child kind of wean and move on to regular food, or moves the child into that stage too quickly, but somehow that conflict is not resolved in an appropriate way, then the child may end up with an oral fixation. Again, that's kind of a word we hear in our vocabulary, oral fixation. Well, what does that mean? That's an adult who's unusually interested in oral activities, and it can be anything from someone who eats too much or talks too much or smoking. Freud would classify all of those as an oral fixation, and that something happened. Again, the person as an adult, right? Maybe it's someone who's a smoker and has trouble smoking, or has trouble stopping smoking, and they may not know or be conscious that they had any problems while they were 1 year old. But nonetheless, Freud would say that it was that unconscious problem in the oral stage that led to an oral fixation later on. And it would probably try to do dream interpretation and all sorts of things to get at what happened, what was the problem at that time. Moving on to the anal stage, this is from about 1.5 to 3 years old, and in this case the focus is on the anus, and the conflict centers on toilet training. This is kind of the big thing that happens during this age time, that children are working on toilet training. And depending on how that goes, either it goes smoothly, you have a parent who is very good about helping the child with independence and working on toilet training, and if there's an accident, which there always is doesn't make too big of a deal about it, and gets them through this stage appropriately. That's great. But if there is a problem during toilet training particularly, this can lead to an anal fixation. It may lead to an adult, and you probably heard of this. Anal, like if you say, oh, you're so anal, you're so organized, and that's a Freudian term. So it may lead to an adult who is unusually rigid, orderly, punctual. We say that person is anal retentive, rule-bound personality. Or if the parent is too, so this may happen if the parent is too upset about, oh my gosh, there's an accident, this is, oh, so dirty, such a problem. It can lead to this anal retentive type of personality. Or a parent who's too lenient and isn't very helpful, and there's kind of messes all the time during this stage, can lead to what they call anal explosive, or a very chaotic, unorganized personality. All right, Freud's psychosexual stages get better every time. We now move to the phallic stage at ages 3 to 6 years old, where the focus is on the genitals. And the conflict really centers on, this is really the idea of figuring out if you're a boy or if you're a girl. That's the idea of kind of the genital stage. And to get even more controversial, Freud talked about that children at this stage, unconsciously, of course, are attracted to their opposite sex parent, and came up with the idea of the Oedipus complex, which is the unconscious attraction that a boy feels towards his mother, and that then he also feels resentment towards his father. The Electra complex is the same process, but for girls, and both conflicts are resolved basically through identification with their same-sex parents, internalizing the behaviors, morals, standards of the same-sex parents, and leads to the development of the superego. You can read more about this in your book. Like I said, this is a pretty controversial at this point, and not terribly based in science, but historically important idea in terms of our personality development. Then Freud goes through this, theorizes that children go through the latency period, ages 6 through puberty, where there's no focus on any particular body part, there's no conflict, and children are really focused on school and learning, and that's where their concentration is. And then we move to the genital stage, which begins at puberty, in which the focus is the genitals, but now not so much as we were in the phallic stage of, well, these are my body parts, and this makes me a girl, and this is your body parts, this makes you a boy. That's the phallic stage. And the genital stage, it's really associated with sexual relationships, and sexual feelings start to emerge and focus on mature adult sexuality. So, all of that being said, Freud's legacy. The psychoanalytic theory made important contributions to the study of personality, and it really was the beginnings of psychology. But there are many, many criticisms. Much of the work is considered unscientific. It fails to appreciate the importance of development beyond childhood, overemphasizes the role of sexuality, overemphasizes the weight on the unconscious, and this theory is based on often a biased and non-representative sample. So it's the beginnings, and that's really why we continue to study Freud. And there are still people who practice psychoanalysis as well. Moving on to some more current theories of personality. Humanistic theories. The humanistic approach emphasizes people's innate goodness and desire to achieve higher levels of functioning. One of the key terms in the humanistic approach is self-actualization, which is a state of self-fulfillment where you reach your highest level, your highest potential, each of us in our unique way, meaning that what would make me feel self-fulfilled, it would be very different than what would make you self-fulfilled, and then what would make my children feel fulfilled. And we're all kind of trying to get to our own unique point of fulfillment. Okay, and the goal of the humanistic theory is to help people get to their own best self. And they talk quite a bit about the real and ideal self-concept, which is a set of beliefs that people hold about who they are as individuals and who they'd like to be. You could try this if you had a little piece of paper with you, or grab one real quick. Look at these 10 traits. You could write down 1 through 10, and then put 3 columns, or 3 columns. And in the first column, put a check next to each item that describes you. And then in the second column, put a check next to each item that describes who you'd like to be. And the third, put a check when you have an overlap between 1 and 2, your columns 1 and 2. So if you have a check in column 1 and a check in column 2, then put a check in column 3. Okay, so you could pause this to do this real quick. And so once you've done it, the first list is your real self. You're putting a check next to each item that describes you. We would call that your real self. The second list would be your ideal self, right? That's who you'd like to be. And the third list, when your real self matches your ideal self, those are traits you already match your ideal, in which you are self-actualized. You're there. And there are probably plenty of these on the internet with many, many traits. I think it's pretty interesting to do this, where you check off, right? Who's the real you, who's the ideal you, and it can give you some insight into your personality and where you'd like to be. The behavioral perspective of personality, this is the idea that personality is a collection of behaviors, all of which have been shaped through learning. And it can be observational learning and modeling. It can be operant conditioning, that you're reinforced. Certain aspects of your personality are strengthened when they're reinforced, right? I don't know, you're in class and you make a joke and everybody laughs and you go, oh, that's a great way to get some friends because everybody's laughing, so I'm going to make more jokes, and then you become kind of a funny kind of class clown person. Or you can think of lots of ways in which different aspects of your personality may be reinforced by others, peers, parents, etc., and that shapes your personality. And you could think about how learning has shaped your own personality. And when you've done something that has not gotten reinforced, or you've gotten some bad feedback for certain behaviors, then you might not do that as often. And even if it's something that perhaps you enjoyed, but you go, oh, nobody really liked that, or my friends thought that was strange, and so I'm not going to do that, and they sort of change your personality. All right, the social cognitive perspective of personality. This combines the social and cognitive approaches. So social meaning observing others, learning by watching, which we talked about. Children do that all the time, and we do that when we're in unfamiliar situations. We can learn by observing how other people act. And cognitive is your own thoughts and feelings. This has to do with the idea of expectancy, that a person's predictions about the consequences or outcomes of behavior affect the development of their personality. So basically, if a child watches a behavior in another that's rewarded, the child might tend to copy the behavior. Okay. So again, if a child watches another child on the playground, like telling jokes and being really silly, and they can see everybody's watching that child and wants to be that child's friend, and everybody's high-fiving, and this child watches and goes, I've observed somebody else making a lot of jokes. I can see that works for that child to be friendly and be popular, so I'm going to tell a lot of jokes, and that is how I will kind of adapt my personality. But if the behavior is seen negatively, or there are negative consequences, the child might not copy that behavior, right? So a child who watches another child maybe be very aggressive on the playground and nobody likes that child and the child's getting in trouble, they might say, hey, that's probably not a good behavior to copy. I will not be aggressive. Locus of control is a key component of personality, and we talk about internal or external locus of control. This is really interesting. The idea being that your internal locus of control, meaning that you internally have a lot of control on a situation. Versus if you're someone who has an external locus of control, you don't feel like you can control outcomes. It's really the situation or other people. You could think about this in terms of, let's say you get a bad grade on a test. Internal locus of control, say, well, I didn't do well on the test. I should study harder, and then I can do better. External locus of control may be someone who says the test was too hard, the teacher was mean, there was nothing I could do about it, I can't do better next time, because really it's just up to the teacher who picks these horrible questions for the test, and I'm just doomed to get bad grades. So very important. And if people who have an internal locus of control can oftentimes feel like they can accomplish much more because it's within their control. Bandura's social cognitive perspective is a very famous researcher. It's the social cognitive perspective of personality. He rejected, again, the exclusive focus on observable behaviors, and that personality results from relationships. Again, that's the social part, and patterns of thinking. Another key term is self-efficacy. This is your belief in how effective you'll be at reaching your goal. And this can be based on past experience or the encouragement and support of other people or lack thereof. So this is the idea of, if you have a really challenging task in front of you, do you feel you'll be able to successfully complete it or not? So someone with high self-efficacy will say, like, oh my gosh, I'm starting college, and I know it's going to be hard, I know it's going to be a challenge, but I really believe I can do it. And that might be based on their past experiences in school. Oh, okay, I've done well in school so far, so I'm pretty sure I can do well in college. It could be others' support or encouragement. I have parents and friends, and they're all supporting me, and they're all telling me I can do it, so I believe I can do it. Someone with low self-efficacy would be saying, I'm starting college, and I don't think I can do it. I don't have very high self-efficacy. I'm really worried. I'm kind of afraid this is not going to work out for me. Maybe because I didn't do well in school before, or other people are telling me I can't do it, and they're not very supportive. People with higher self-efficacy are more likely to set higher goals for themselves, and they work harder to attain these goals and achieve more success. All right. And then the trait theory of personality, the idea here is that we have different traits, which are relatively stable properties that describe different elements of your personality. And trait theories seek to identify basic traits and describe would describe a person's personality. The proposal here is that all people possess certain traits, but the degree varies, and you can actually quantify where people fall on these different traits, and that they fall somewhere on a continuum. And based on what we know about these traits, we can predict people's behaviors. Gordon Allport was one of the first trait theorists who created a comprehensive list of traits to be used to operationalize the terminology used in personality research. So you can see here here's one trait, between reserved and outgoing. And where do you fall on this continuum? Not just I'm reserved or outgoing, but maybe on a scale of 1 to 10. Where do you find yourself? And are you a concrete thinker or an abstract thinker? And where do you find yourself on that continuum? Are you very affected by your feelings, or are you emotionally stable? That's another trait. And where do you fall on that continuum? Right? Submissive versus dominant, serious versus happy-go-lucky. So these are all sorts of traits, and we can all look at this, let's say, list of 16 and see where we would place ourselves on all of these different traits. There was also Eisnick's 3 dimensions of personality. In terms of trait theory, this is just looking at 3 key traits of extroversion, how sociable somebody is, neuroticism, how emotionally stable they are, and psychoticism, the degree to which reality is distorted. And there are many of these trait theories that we use currently. Here's the 5-factor model of personality with the acronym OCEAN. And so this is the big 5 personality factors here. Are you open to experience, right? Are you more independent, imaginative? Do you like variety, or are you more conforming, practical, and prefer routine? Are you conscientious, right? Where are you on this trait? Careful, disciplined, organized, or more careless, impulsive, disorganized? Extroversion, are you talkative, fun-loving, social versus quiet, sober, retiring? Agreeableness, are you very agreeable or fault-finding, unfriendly, cold? And then neuroticism or emotional stability, are you more stable, calm, secure, or tense, anxious, insecure? So this is one that there's been quite a lot of research on. Studies show that there seems to be a genetic basis for these 5 factors, and that these traits are generally stable over time for periods as long as 40 years. Again, you can think about yourself on these traits and see if you think they've been pretty stable over your lifespan so far. I can say for me, they certainly have been. In terms of trait theories, his or her traits across cultures, women score higher on conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Men show greater openness to experience. Kind of interesting. Not everybody, of course, but overall. In terms of culture, there's been some research to assess the big 5 traits from people from many different cultures. And when they compared the results of the personality test with national stereotypes, like for particular cultures or countries, they found no evidence that the stereotypes actually mirrored reality, that really people from all cultures have all different types of personalities, which makes sense. In terms of trait theories, the strengths is that this research has led to new insights on psychological phenomenon and has facilitated research topics on seemingly unrelated topics to psychology, like politics. Pretty interesting. There's been a lot of research on trait theory that's really fascinating. Limitations, it really isn't explaining the origins of your personality. It's just describing your personality currently. And environmental influences on personality are underestimated. We're really talking about, like, this is really focusing on, oh, this is just who you are as a person, and not how did you maybe learn to have some of these traits. How do we assess personality? With psychological testing, basically, which are standard measures designed to assess behavior and personality. We need our tests to be reliable and valid. Reliable meaning that they produce consistent and stable results. One thing we want to be sure of is we get test-retest reliability, which means if you give the person the test and give the person the same test again, you want them to get similar scores. And inter-rater reliability, meaning if one rater or a judge or a psychologist grades a test, well, think about this as a teacher. If I grade your test, you should get the same grade if I grade it as if another psychology professor grades the same test. We would want those same 2 grades to be the same. And if you have a very subjective test, like let's say an essay test, if I give you a grade and another psychology teacher gives you a grade, we might give you very different grades because that's a very subjective test. Wouldn't have a lot of inter-rater reliability. If I give you a multiple choice test, and I grade it, and I'm just looking, right, A, B, C, D, and I'm comparing it to the answer key, and I give it to another psychology professor, we should come up with the same results for you on that test, because that is a very objective, clear test. There would be a lot of inter-rater reliability. And validity is the degree to which a test measures what it's intended to measure, particularly when we're talking about personality. If I give you a personality test, am I really measuring your personality? And we can look at that by predictive validity. If I measure your personality to say you're very introverted, well, I could predict things about your behavior based on that you're introverted or extroverted or open to new experiences. If I test you and find that you're very open to new experiences, I might predict that you would do some more risky things than someone like me who's not terribly open to new experiences. And so we should be able to predict things about your personality and behaviors based on the test that we give you if it's got validity. Tests are based on norms or standards of test performance that permit comparison of one person's score with scores of others who have taken the same test. So one way we do personality testing is with interviews, and just sitting down and interviewing a patient. And there are different types of interviews. Unstructured means unstructured. I have no questions I'm particularly going to ask you. I just think about it as it's a conversation. You give me an answer and I ask you another question, and you give me an answer and I ask you another question, and it's just a conversation where I'm trying to get information about you. You can contrast that with structured interviews. There are structured psychological interviews that are actually have the whole list of questions that you're going to ask your patient, and you have to ask them exactly all those questions in exactly that order. You can't deviate from it at all. And every patient gets that same structured interview. Semi-structured would be right in the middle, where there are certain questions that you must ask, and then after you get an answer, you may be able to follow up or clarify their answers and get a little more detail. Let's see. You can see there are strengths and weaknesses to both. Unstructured interviews feel very comfortable, right? Because you're kind of having a conversation with somebody. The patient typically feels more comfortable. But you might forget to ask certain questions, just like in a regular conversation, or if you have ever had the experience of interviewing somebody for a job or for anything, or you've been an interviewee. If it's unstructured, you may forget to ask a very important question that may hold the key to this person's personality, right? And maybe it's got a, I don't know, a 15-year-old girl who's in my office for a psychological appointment, and we're having an unstructured interview, and I'm asking her all sorts of questions, but I never ask her, do you use any illicit drugs? And maybe she does. And maybe that's pretty much the key to what's going on with her. In an unstructured interview, I might just not ask the question, and then you don't get the answer. Structured interviews, they're very, very long. I've given many structured interviews, and they can take 3 or 4 hours because every single person gets asked every single question. Even if it totally doesn't apply, you have to follow those rules. And also, they are a little bit more unnatural, right? Because you're not really having a conversation, you're asking a list of questions. Semi-structured, kind of in the middle. Strengths of interviews, just as a technique for assessing someone's personality, it's nice because it provides you an opportunity to observe facial expressions, body language, etc. But limitations, certainly clients might lie or misrepresent themselves, and it might be influenced by interviewer bias. Everyone has a bias. All of us come to the world with our own unconscious biases. And so just for whatever reason, you may not even be aware of it, that might influence how you're interpreting what the person is saying to you. We can do projective tests for personality testing. Projective tests are assessments used to explore characteristics that might not be accessible through interview or observation. These are psychoanalytic tests, kind of starting from Freud, where the test taker is presented with ambiguous stimuli and then projects meaning onto them. That's the idea of projective tests. You give someone something ambiguous and ask them about it, and they project meaning onto it, And that gives us a little glimpse into their unconscious. And there we go. There's Freud for you. Two of the widely known projective tests, Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test. You've probably seen the ink blot test on TV, a TV show or a movie. This was developed by Rorschach, updated by Exner in the 1970s. There are a number of different ink blots that look like this. They're just ambiguous. And you ask the patient, what do you see? So here's this, what do you see? And they just give you responses. And some are black and white, some are more colorful. Again, what do you see? And so there are 10 cards, and 5 in color, 5 in black and white, that we're asked to give multiple responses. And so the person just says what they think they see. And then there is a scoring system where depending on what the person sees, we can say something about their personality. And again, looks like 2 people. That's maybe a typical response. The people are fighting. That could suggest that the fighting indicates there are issues with aggression or aggressive personality, or they're carrying something heavy together, focuses on working together, could represent a need for social connection. So you can see you're taking something that has something that's very ambiguous, you're having the person project their thoughts and hopefully some bits of their unconscious onto that ink blot, and then we interpret what that means. All right. And then the thematic apperception test. This is another projective test where there are pictures and with cards, and you ask the person to tell a story about the cards. So you can look at some of these pictures and say, I want you to tell me a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The person tells you a story. And then again, you will be interpreting the themes, right? The thematic apperception test. What are the themes? Are there themes of sadness? Are there themes of aggression in a lot of the stories, etc.? So in terms of the strengths, because they're unstructured, and people really don't know how to respond, there doesn't seem to be a right or a wrong way to tell me what does this look like to you. People are more apt to be honest and speak freely. The limitations are they're time consuming, and the scoring and interpretation is somewhat subjective. That idea of inter-rater reliability, not as great in this type of testing because different people might interpret, different psychologists might interpret responses in a different way. We can use objective tests or questionnaires. Objective tests are a set of questions with answer choices, and there are clear scoring instructions that are identical for everyone. So the questions might be true, false. An example of that is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. Might have heard of that one. That's a very popular one. It's the most commonly used objective personality test that is used to identify disorders and abnormal behaviors. There are 338 true-false items that load into 10 clinical scales, like depression and anxiety and things like that. And it's often used to inform decisions about custody or legal issues and in a variety of non-clinical settings. I've given this test many times. So it's very objective, meaning it actually has a Scantron. True, false, with 338 items. And so people have to just fill those in. And from that, you can look at, and I'll show you in a second, kind of if their person is out of the typical range on a number of different personality traits. The Myers-Briggs type inventory, this measures 4 dimensions of personality: introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuiting, thinking versus feeling, judgment versus perception. It's quite popular, especially in the corporate world, but there's not a lot of supporting research on the test's reliability and validity. Here's another one, the 16 personality factor questionnaire. The idea here in the MMPI kind of looks the same, that on these different traits, here's someone, they're more kind of reserved, this is comparing airline pilots to writers. So we've got writers here, more reserved compared to outgoing, right? This is a continuum. After they've filled out all of these questions and this test is scored and then plotted, and then concrete thinker to abstract thinker, right? Writers are more abstract in their thinking, etc. And so you could get an individual personality profile like this. In terms of objective personality tests, the strengths are that you can check the validity of the test taker's responses, and we can say that they're more reliable in terms of inter-rater reliability. Limitations is some people might lie, right? If it asks you, are you depressed? And you do not want to say you're depressed, then you would say false, right? It's easier to lie than perhaps on a projective test. And social desirability can influence the results. People want to look good, even in the eyes of their psychologist. So if it asks, do you drink alcohol frequently? You might say no, just because you're embarrassed or don't want to say so. Do you exercise every day? You might say yes, even if you don't, but you kind of rationalize it. Oh, well, I walk to my car every day and I walk around my house, so I'm going to just consider that exercise. So you get some people answering things to present themselves in a more positive light. That's social desirability. And there's a lack of flexibility and failure to appreciate the diversity of individual experience. Everybody gets the same test, everybody gets the same questions, and so it may not apply to everyone. All right, thank you all very much.